All right, thank you. Welcome, everyone. We are delighted to welcome you today to our final event in our lecture series for fall semester 2023, where we have been exploring the theme, the preservation and transformation of culture. And we're really excited today, especially because we will be welcoming our three student Kennedy Research Fellows. And so these are students who have been working on research projects for the last several months, and we're excited to hear the results of their projects today. Our first speaker is Addison Graham, who was a senior majoring in American Studies and Spanish. For the past year, Addison has been closely following the Great Salt Lake's uncertain future, and he has twice written about the issue in the Washington Post. And so that's impressive. After graduating, Addison hopes to pursue a master's degree in global food security and nutrition, and he will be discussing his essay, A Crisis of Culture, Science, Society, and the Great Salt Lake. So, Addison.
Thank you, Dr. Benful, for that introduction, and thank you so much to everybody who made it possible for us to be here today. I'm very grateful. The earth belongs in usufruct to the living. Now, I have to be careful with that quote, but if I'm lucky enough to pronounce it correctly, I think it's a pretty compelling statement. Who wrote it? The same guy who wrote the Declaration of Independence. In fact, Thomas Jefferson, who was one of America's early and most prominent advocates of agrarianism, wrote that in a letter to his friend James Madison. The word usufruct means the right to enjoy the use and advantages of another's property, short of the destruction or waste of that substance. In other words, Jefferson is making a statement on stewardship, the idea that the earth is only ours for a time, and therefore we need to treat it well, both for the sake of our neighbors and for those future generations. So how is modern Utah doing with its stewardship? Or with its usufruct, if you love that word as much as me? For this project, I went around the state interviewing a lot of different people, mostly farmers. And I was struck by how many of these farmers chose to talk to me about stewardship, oftentimes without me prompting them to do so. They spoke about being deeply connected to the land and to its resources. Audrey Yardley, an alfalfa farmer in San Pete County, said to me, "We live and breathe the farm nearly every day, and with that living and breathing comes a passion for the land, a passion I have grown to love sharing, especially with my kids." Many of these farmers also spoke of stewardship as being a key tenet of their religious faith. But there is a crisis in Utah that puts any profession of stewardship to the test for both urban environmentalists and for rural farmers. The Great Salt Lake is dying, and we are responsible. Overuse of water, mostly in agriculture, but also in outdoor urban areas, has swiftly caused the decline of the Great Salt Lake, which happens to be the largest saline lake in North America. As of 2022, roughly 3/4 of the overall water volume of the lake had simply disappeared. Though the sustained drought and rising temperatures that we are experiencing in Utah has partly contributed to the crisis, the heart of the problem really is overconsumption. And this overconsumption comes with it implications from economic upheaval to public health crises. To lose the Great Salt Lake is to lose an essential ecosystem, but this is not just an ecological problem or an ecological crisis. This is a cultural crisis, a crisis for which one shrinking body of water serves as a barometer. To me, the most disconcerting part of the lake's decline is that the health of the lake directly reflects the health of civil society, both literally and physically, and metaphorically as well. Farmers, developers, and everyday citizens have been drawing from the same well for quite some time without consequence. And now that well is drying up. And it is only when there is a shortage of resources in these kinds of struggles that deep divides become so evident. The Great Salt Lake is caught in a tug of war between urban and rural, between the collective good and individual rights. Some demonize farmers and others dismiss environmentalists, and meanwhile, the lake disappears. But until we solve the cultural crisis, the ecological crisis will persist. Until we begin to mend the cultural divides, then the lake will be left to die. Let me spell out just a few of the consequences of losing this lake. The lake is an essential habitat for 12 million migratory birds. It is also the #1 home in the world to brine shrimp, small, half-inch water-dwelling creatures that feed many of the migratory birds. What's interesting is that these brine shrimp also feed 45% of the table shrimp that we consume worldwide. To lose this lake would be devastating. U.S. magnesium also operates out at the lake. The U.S. gets all of its magnesium from the Great Salt Lake, and 14% of the magnesium produced worldwide also comes from the lake. Magnesium is an important ingredient in aluminum alloys, which are important for cell phones, computers, and other technologies, meaning that to lose the lake also comes with some pretty serious geopolitical ramifications as well. Sulfate of potash is harvested at the lake. This is used for fertilizer for crops, mostly almonds and stone fruits. So the decline of the lake spells trouble for the agriculture in California, but it will hit industry and the economy in Utah especially hard. The ski industry, which attracts millions of out-of-state visitors each year, relies on the lake for what's called lake effect snow for roughly 5 to 10% of the snowfall in the mountains. Now that may not seem like a lot, but usually that snowfall comes at the beginning and the end of the season, which stretches out the season, making it much more lucrative. Now what's interesting is one executive in the ski industry said this to me: "A shorter ski season is concerning, but I'm more concerned with my ability to staff the resorts. Nobody wants to live in a toxic dust bowl." And in Salt Lake City and all throughout the Wasatch Front, the toxic dust is what everyone is talking about. Heavy metals, including arsenic, are found in the lake bed. Arsenic is a naturally occurring substance in the lake, but there are also other pollutants that have accumulated over time through urban runoff, coal burning, fertilizers getting into waterways. As the shoreline recedes, and as this lake bed turns dustier and drier, these leftover toxins can be kicked up with the dust and carried to the lungs of nearby inhabitants. They have been linked to not only respiratory illnesses, but also cognitive impairments, birth defects, and heart disease. To combat this worsening problem, some suggest that we should build a pipeline from the Pacific Ocean that will bring salt water to the lake. A group of BYU researchers recently looked at that proposal, and they said that not only is the infrastructure not feasible, but it would be astronomically expensive. So ecologists and other experts say that the only way to save this lake is to conserve. Agriculture consumes the majority of water within both the Great Salt Lake watershed and the state of Utah. And so you can imagine that farmers are feeling a bit defensive as they cling on to their water rights, which to them represents their livelihood. Can we really expect farmers to give up the one career that many of them have ever known? Many of these farmers are descendants of the Mormon pioneers who arrived here and first irrigated these valleys, who brought water from the mountains and cultivated crops on the valley floors in order to survive. They have inherited water rights from their ancestors. But what about the little kids who play outside in West Valley? Do they have rights? Or are respiratory illnesses, highly polluted airs, and potential cognitive impairments simply their lot in life? The debate surrounding these questions is visceral. And the toxic winds that blow from the lake swirl in our larger political discourse. You cannot sow the winds of toxicity and not reap the whirlwinds of disease, social and otherwise. But maybe a crisis like this doesn't just have the power to deepen, expose, or exacerbate the divides that already exist between us. Maybe it also has the power to apply some positive pressure in moving us toward healing. This might take some serious self-reflection. Most of Utah's water goes to watering alfalfa, a very thirsty crop used to feed cattle and other livestock. One might ask, why don't we just stop growing so much alfalfa? Well, there are reasons that farmers choose to grow alfalfa in Utah. It's a very sturdy crop, and it gives the producer a lot more security as opposed to growing a crop like vegetables. And there's another nuance which I think often gets overlooked. Whether you grow alfalfa in Cache Valley or dine on steak in Salt Lake Valley, the producers and the consumers of goods share the responsibility of any environmental degradation that occurs during the production of those goods. And most of the farmers that I spoke to, their number one plea was that they don't get solely blamed for the crisis at the lake. Spencer Gibbons, the CEO of the Utah Farm Bureau, said to me, "I don't think anyone wants to be in a position where we lose that lake and its ecosystem. But I do think it's going to take a concerted effort in every direction, from our agricultural community to our urban friends." A lot of other farmers also point out that what's the point of letting a field go dry if that same water that is saved is simply going to be slurped up downstream by a developer who wants to put in houses with pristine Kentucky bluegrass in the front yard? And I think they have a point there. Urban dwellers have to start getting on board with the idea that they are both part of the problem and part of the solution. There also needs to be a mindset shift among some members of the agricultural community. One farmer said this, "I was in a meeting with the new commissioner of the Great Salt Lake. His plan is to take 30% of agricultural water and dump it into the Great Salt Lake. I'm against any legislation that will turn agricultural water into salt water." To someone who fears the sight of a dry field more than the sight of a dry lake bed, the word fallow, which means to let cropland go dry, is the F word. And believe me when I say these people aren't even fazed by the word usufruct, so that's pretty telling. But a substantial amount of farmland will likely have to be fallowed if we want to save this lake. And farmers have to start getting past the idea, in some instances, that any drop of water that makes it to the lake is simply wasted agricultural water. If urban inhabitants can accept the fact that this is a collective problem, and if farmers on a large scale can start really taking pride in fulfilling their responsibility to get more water to the lake, then we can start moving towards meaningful solutions. The commissioner of the Great Salt Lake, a guy named Brian Steed, is anxiously working to find solutions that don't involve water grabs or land grabs. He wants to compensate farmers by leasing the water that they choose not to use. This is called split season leasing, and what it means is that farmers will maybe irrigate their alfalfa for 2 cuts, and then they will be compensated for not watering their alfalfa for the third and fourth cut, for instance. Bear in mind that this water then needs to be shepherded to the Great Salt Lake after it is conserved. Saline lakes all across the world are in decline. And to date, none have been rescued. Not a single saline lake has been rescued. To buck that trend here in Utah, we have to start landing on the solutions that will both protect the rights and livelihoods of farmers while also protecting the kids who play outside in West Valley and all throughout the Wasatch Front from toxic winds. Winds which serve as a damning physical manifestation of a failure to act collectively. This semester's Kennedy Center theme is preserving and transforming culture, and there's so much about Utah farming and Utah's broader culture that deserves to be preserved. But if we want to save this lake, we need some serious cultural transformation if we are to first tackle this cultural crisis and save this ecosystem. And if we are to make good on our responsibility to be stewards of the land, both for our neighbors today and for future generations. After all, the earth belongs only in usufruct to the living. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Addison. Our second speaker will be Kyli Fox Soug, who is a senior in the Sociology program with minors in International Development and Global and Community Impact. Kyli is passionate about social impact as she has worked at the Ballard Center for Social Impact for over 2 years. She has done international fieldwork in Rwanda and in the coming months in Cambodia, and she plans to pursue a master's in public administration and become a social impact evaluator for nonprofit, government, and non-governmental organizations. Her paper is entitled Patterns of Genocide, 9 Cultures Since 1975.
Okay. Hello. Let me just set this up. Okay. Present. Sorry.
Should be.
Is that?
Oh,
Oh, perfect. Thank you. Okay, hello everyone. As was mentioned, I'm Kyli, and I'm talking about Patterns of Genocide, 9 Cultures Since 1975. And it's not a paper per se, it's a painting right there that I painted, and I'll kind of talk more about that. But yeah, just a few things to go over, kind of an obvious warning. I'm talking about genocide 9 different times, so this is a really serious topic, and I've tried my best to be respectful and kind of have reverence as I've done this project. And so my interest began in genocide. As was mentioned, I did field research in Rwanda last summer. We were working with female artisans with a nonprofit, understanding how a fair wage can help their quality of life. And this was my first experience working with people that had actually experienced genocide. A lot of the women we had worked with had husbands that were killed, children that were killed, people they couldn't find, people that had committed murder themselves, people that had scars, had disabilities because of what had happened in Rwanda. And these are some images of memorials. There's over 200 memorials in Rwanda from the genocide. So it's really in your face there as we worked there. And so, that brought up a lot of questions, like how can a country, a people, culture move on after such an atrocity? And then my research question, which I kind of stole from the Kennedy Center, but how cultures are both preserved and transformed through genocide. And I chose 1975 because I'm also going to Cambodia in April. And so 1975 is kind of the marker for me of like modern genocides, or how I'm calling modern genocides. And I also want to focus on less well-known and more recent genocides, just because they're happening and I didn't know about them. And so really quickly, kind of my methodology. One thing I want to mention with this slide is that these patterns are not necessarily based off of what you would consider the traditional costumes of the cultures. They're based off of clothing of refugees that I found during my research. And I wanted to highlight this because, you know, as a refugee, a lot of people come with only the clothes on their bodies, and so that, you know, is the most important thing to them. And so I chose to kind of honor that process. Okay, so the represented groups, hopefully you can kind of see it a little bit better, but I won't be going in depth about all of these, but first Cambodia, and then Timor-Leste, which is an island in Indonesia, and Guatemala, the Darfur region in Sudan, the Yazidi people in Iraq, and the Uyghur people in China. And then the ones I'll be talking about today are Bosnia, Rwanda, and the Rohingya. Just really quickly, the definition of genocide. This is the UN definition created in 1948. The proven intent to destroy a national, ethnical, racial, or religious group. And in order to be constituted as genocide, it has to fit into one of these elements of crime. Okay, so Bosnia. Probably some of you know about this conflict, but in 1992 to 93, there was a mass genocide of Bosniak people, also known as Bosnian Muslims, and this was caused because of the collapse of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia was created after World War II, and it was this big conglomeration of different languages and people and cultures, and it was really held together by this one person, President Tito, who combined Yugoslavia under communist rule, and he died in 1980, so that caused a lot of upheaval. And because of that, Bosnia declared independence in 1992, and the proposed area of Bosnia would be 80% Bosniak Muslims versus the Bosniak Serb minority. And so they followed kind of this Greater Serbia campaign to ethnically cleanse the Bosnian Serbs. And this is the first usage of ethnic cleansing. It's actually a Yugoslav word used in the military to mean cleansing of an enemy area. And they did that so that it wouldn't be constituted as genocide. But Bosnian Muslims were taken into concentration camps and systematically raped and killed. 100,000 people were killed, and probably the most well-known massacre was in the capital city, where 8,000 men were rounded up and killed, and that was the largest massacre since World War II. And I wanted to highlight Bosnia because of this aspect of women and rape. The international crime tribunals were created after this period, and this was the first time in history in which rape was considered a weapon of war and a crime against humanity. Before that, it was literally termed by the UN and used as such as collateral damage. Okay, so Rwanda. This was a really short genocide. It was only from April to June of '94, and this is another kind of ethnic battle or cleansing. You may know of like the Hutus versus the Tutsis. These divisions were created by Belgian colonizers who measured their hands and the bridges of their noses. This very arbitrary divisions were created, and that created a lot of problems after they left in the 50s, when they left the Tutsis in charge, you could say. And so a lot of propaganda, a lot of things leading up to this. But what's important to know about the Rwandan genocide is that it's a civilian genocide by civilians. Neighbors killed neighbors, intermarried couples killed each other. This was committed by normal people. And so 500,000 people were killed, and in Rwanda you can literally see the mass graves. It was in the 90s, so they have rows and rows of collected clothing of children and women, and rape was also used as a weapon of war. And then finally the Rohingya. This one is really recent, in 2017. They're a population living here in this red region in Myanmar for centuries. They've been stateless since 1982, which means that they have no legal protections. They are no citizen of any country. They're seen as foreigners, and they are branded as such in the law. And then in 2017, the government branded them as a terrorist organization, which caused 700,000 people to flee into Bangladesh, particularly Cox's Bazar in that orange region there where 1 million of them still live today. And this is constituted as genocide because they placed landmines at the borders and they shot civilians as they were fleeing. Okay, so 3.8 million, those are the people represented in my painting that have been killed because of genocide since 1975. And just some closing thoughts, like why study this, why this is important to me. Particularly the role of women. I was really shocked to find that it wasn't until the 90s that rape was considered a crime against humanity instead of just collateral damage. Genocides and wars are continuing and have been fought on the bodies of women, and I don't think that story has been told a lot. I also recently found out that 400,000 women were systematically raped in concentration camps in the Holocaust, and I didn't know about that. And then also the peacekeeping aspect. In Rwanda, they talked a lot about what happened after the genocide, and they do this really cool thing. Well, we'll see if it's cool, but they do these peacekeeping local groups where they share what had happened to them on both sides. So if people were to share how many people they had killed, they would receive amnesty if they told them where their family members had buried them. And then they told them how many people that they knew that had been killed. And they also do service projects, mandatory service projects. People no longer identify as Hutu and Tutsi, but they still do projects. And we were there in June, which is the month of service in Rwanda. So every week they had mandatory service projects of cleaning the roads, cleaning water, bridges, and we had to stop our research for that. And it seems to be working pretty well. And then also the refugee crisis. As I mentioned earlier, I'm really interested in this kind of creation of refugees through genocide. I mentioned the 3.8 million people that we believe were killed in these genocides, but there's millions more that were made refugees because of this crisis and different crises. So this is kind of my culminating thought that preservation and transformation comes in moving forward, how people are able to move forward with their enemies living in the same state as them, move forward into places where they don't feel they belong, how they're able to still connect with each other and maintain their cultural dignity. I've really enjoyed doing this project, and there were so many that I didn't know, and there's even more from 1975 on that are not included in this project. But I just want to leave with you all to think about how we can create peace in our world, to be aware of these things, be cognizant of the people involved and the people that continue to be impacted by these genocides. So, thank you.
Thank you very much. Indeed, our final speaker is Ryan Wolff, who studies statistics and Middle East Studies Arabic. He graduates this semester and plans to spend the next several months volunteering and studying Arabic in Jordan. He has also published research on modern Turkish history and the economic roots of Islamism. Ryan will present his paper entitled Reconquering Swedenistan, How Integration Failures and the Degradation of Law and Order Turned Swedish Governmental Policy and Sentiment Against Middle Eastern Immigrants and Refugees. So, Ryan.
Still lagging, just 1 second. All right, perfect. So I'm Ryan Wolff, and as was said, my project is entitled Reconquering Swedenistan. And in this project, I would like to evaluate the rising anti-immigrant sentiment, both in Europe and across Sweden, from a new perspective. Typically, we see this dichotomy of people either saying, well, Muslims and Arab immigrants have no place in the West. They can't integrate. They're at a fundamental odd with Western society. On the other side of that, you get a group of people who say, well, any movement, any nationalist movement that arises in Europe to defend its borders or try to encourage assimilation is racist or fascist. And I think that until we can take the subjective, until we can extract the data from this subjective conversation and look at the objective, we're facing a time bomb in Sweden and the rest of Europe. And so a quick note on the title of my presentation, Reconquering Swedenistan. Swedenistan is a somewhat popular internet term. It's derogatory, and it's the way that some people refer to Sweden now that it's become quite Middle Eastern. They call it Swedenistan because about 30% of the population is either immigrants or the children of immigrants. And so for Swedes and Arabs alike in Sweden, they're facing an existential crisis where for Swedes, they feel like they're living in a new country, a foreign country, and they want to reconquer their culture. For Arabs, say particularly Syrians and Iraqis, Sweden is their last chance because they can't go back to their home country. Many who do return are killed. And so, just as a general introduction, so I want to look at the last decade, so 2012-ish through 2023. As you'll see that in this yellow region, there was a giant spike in immigration, both to Europe, but particularly to Sweden. And most of these immigrants were coming from Iraq, Syria, Afghanistan, Middle Eastern countries, right? But then you can see in 2016, immigration peaks. And this was sort of the end of Sweden's open border policies. You can see immigration quickly falls as the government and the Swedish people began to turn against immigrants. And you can see if you look at the projections past our current year, the Swedish government has said, not that it expects there to be no refugees from the Middle East, but we're only taking this many, right? There will not be another 2016 because we're facing the current consequences of mass immigration from the Middle East. And so what I wanted to study is, why did the Swedish government change its policies so drastically in 2016? Why did it go from potentially the world leader in immigration openness to being quite restrictive? And one of my two factors that I isolated is failures of assimilation and integration, meaning that Arabs, and especially Muslims in Sweden, have failed to integrate. So typically, whenever you have two cultures interact, especially through immigration, both cultures are diluted a little bit, just naturally from the interactions, right? That makes sense. But that interaction is especially strong when you look at two diametrically opposed, or that's probably not the right word, two very different cultures, like Sweden here being one of the most self-expressive, secular, progressive countries on earth. And then you have this influx of immigrants from the Afro-Islamic countries, which are more survivalist, traditional, and religious. That's not to say that one of these cultures is objectively better than the others, but it is to say that when you take a giant group of people from a culture that in many ways is the complete opposite of the host culture, those natural tendencies towards conflict that you're going to see between those communities are only heightened. And the Swedish community especially is quite strange in its commitment to order and to communalism. They have concepts like jantelagen, which means like humility, equality, conformity, that even if you're better than your neighbor, you're smarter, you're richer, you don't say it. You're the same as them, and you do everything for the community. The community's welfare is more important than your own. And for this reason, you have very little, historically, very little crime in Sweden. And Swedes are shocked if crime rates skyrocket, right? Because for them, the community is everything. Similarly, they have ideas like lagom, which means moderation, balance, or appropriateness. You're always just enough of something. You're never too religious. You're never too extreme. You're never too political. And of course, this is a little bit diametrically opposed with a religion like Islam that outwardly expresses itself in things like praying 5 times a day. And so there's these natural kind of nebulous cultural conflicts between Sweden and the Arab immigrants that are coming in. But what are the real life implications of that? How do those cultural cleavages manifest? Well, a lot of it is geographic, social, and economic. And so this is a demographic map of Stockholm, and the black areas represent areas in which the population, the male population aged 14 to 44, is at least 50% from a migrant background. The blue dots represent what you may have heard of no-go zones, areas that the Swedish police and government have dictated to be particularly vulnerable to crime, gang violence, poverty, failures in education. And you'll notice that virtually all of them are within immigrant-heavy areas. And the Swedish police and government have come out and said, yeah, these immigrant-heavy areas are far worse off than the Swedish-predominated areas, despite our efforts to integrate these people. And so what you've gotten is a sort of self-sorting where both due to systemic factors, but also due to just cultural preferences and cultural cleavages, you have Swedish sides of town and you have Arab sides of town, and they do not interact. And one of the problems with this, when you don't interact and you live next door to such a diametrically opposed culture, is that tensions begin to grow. And so for the Swedes, like I said before, they're thinking, our culture is dying out. Our birth rate is lower. The immigrants keep coming. What is Sweden going to be in 50 years? And for the Arabs, they're thinking, I left Syria hoping for a better life. I want to preserve my language, to teach my kids about my culture. And these Swedes, they want me to turn into one of them, right? So you have this bitter tension across Sweden. And this manifests especially strongly in law and order, because unfortunately, so as I previously described, Swedish culture is very communal, crime rates are traditionally low, but over the last decade, as immigration increased over this wave, gun violence in Sweden, or gun homicides, increased by 253%. And Sweden, as of 2022, had 6 times more gun violence deaths than Norway, Finland, and Denmark combined. Stockholm's gun crime is 30 times that of London. And so you have these Swedes whose culture is so dedicated to law, order, organization, and social cohesion, who are terrified because they're thinking, my neighborhood had 0 murders for 10 years, and now we're seeing 3, 4. If I stay on my train past my stop, am I going to get assaulted? Am I going to get murdered? Because you have these segregated communities. And so as crime starts to spill over a little bit into predominantly Swedish areas, you're getting this tension where Swedes are starting to think, it's me or you, and I'm going to choose me. And so you can actually see this here in these maps, the geographic factors. So on the left, we have gun violence across Stockholm since 2018. And on the right, we have that same demographic map of Stockholm, just zoomed out. And you can see this, look at this inverted green Y trend line. You can see that virtually all of the violence is taking place in immigrant-heavy areas. And that's not to say that immigrants commit more violence just because they're immigrants. There are countless factors like economic, education factors. They're living rougher lives, as we'll get into. But it means that we can't just say that the Swedes are racist because they're afraid of the Arabs. The Arabs and the immigrants are overrepresented in these crime statistics, and the Swedes are terrified. And so I wanted to measure, obviously, the changing sentiment in Sweden as they face these failures of assimilation and this rising crime rate that's so abnormal. And so what I did is I went to the government's archive of 29,000 documents, and I scraped all of the documents. And then I took their text and I analyzed the sentiment for every document. And I gave it a score. How fearful is the rhetoric, and how aggressive or violent is the rhetoric? And then I combined them into a score called the fear-violence score, the fear-violence sentiment. And after each document had a score, I was able to separate them into 2 groups. Those containing keywords talking about immigration, because for those documents I can assume, well, they're probably about immigration, right? If they talk about Muslims and asylum seekers. And then a group of documents unrelated to those keywords, so maybe about healthcare. And then by comparing the fear violence scores on average for those two groups, we can see if the Swedish government is particularly aggressive or fearful in its speech about immigrants, right? And so I actually have this web app I developed so you can explore the data yourself. I don't want to tell you what to think about the data. Remember, I want to take a step back from the subjective and go into the objective. So scan that. If you have your computer, it's even better on the computer because it's like a web app, right? And there's the URL down there. I'm going to pull that up real quick and just do a quick demo so you kind of know how it works. All right, perfect. So from this homepage, this data exploration tab is really useful. They're all useful, but this is probably the most useful. You can go in and you have 5 charts that you can use so that you can compare different things at the same time. And you can choose any metric you want. Let's say I want to look at poverty rates in Sweden. I can pull that up, it'll define it for me, it'll graph it, and then let's say I wanted to look at the relationship between poverty rates and the Swedish sentiment scores, the Swedish government document aggression in immigrant-related documents. Well, then I can select scatter plot, and I can choose the next metric, and I can see the scatter plot and see if there's a relationship. The reason I built this app is so that people like you who are interested in this topic but don't have quite a comprehensive view of this type of data can go in and draw your own conclusions, right? Going back to the line graph, if you see a deviation that you think looks interesting, like, oh wow, in 2017 there was a dip in the disparity in poverty rates in Sweden, so for whatever reason, immigrants were at less of a risk compared to natives than they usually are, then you can pop over here to the sidebar, select the year you want to look at, and notable news stories about immigration, assimilation, and crime across both Sweden and Europe will pop up. That's a different assignment. Okay. So I'll just tell you guys some of the most important conclusions I came to. So in testing some metrics for seeing if law and order had gotten any better or worse since that 2016 immigration peak, I noted that law and order has gotten statistically significantly worse in Sweden since that immigration peak, meaning that the Swedes, they have the right to have at least the perception that as immigration has gotten worse, so has law and order. That's not to say that the immigrants are the reason for that, but you can't fault the Swedes for that perception because statistically it exists. Reported cases of sexual offenses per 100,000, people prosecuted for deadly force per 100,000 are both up significantly. And then on kind of the immigrant side, Swedish assimilation efforts since 2016 have completely failed. Despite all these government programs, we see either no improvement in the disparity between Swedish kids and immigrant kids, or an increase in the disparity between those groups for the rate of people not in education and employment, the percent of people leaving education early, the percent of people at risk for poverty and social exclusion, and annual disposable income. So immigrants are progressively becoming worse off compared to native Swedes economically, socially, educationally, despite the Swedish government's so-called best efforts. And so you get two things out of this. You get Swedes who are frustrated because they feel like they're in danger and they feel like they're giving programs to immigrants who refuse to take advantage of them and integrate. And you get Arabs that come to Sweden and they say, I came to Sweden for a better life and my life is getting progressively worse compared to the native population every year. Why? Like it must be your fault. It can't be my fault. You designed the system. And so they do things like join gangs, and that leads to fluctuations in crime. But going back to our dependent variable, how does this affect the Swedish sentiment? Well, when you look at the scores, the fear violence scores for immigration and non-immigration related documents, you note that immigration related documents, and remember, this is from the government, so these are going to be like the most neutral, politically manipulated texts in Sweden, like they're going to be far more neutral than the average public opinion poll, for example. Immigration-related documents were more than 6 times more aggressive and fearful than other government documents. And so the Swedish government clearly doesn't think too highly of the immigration issue. They're concerned. They have that existential angst still. And we see this electorally even. In 2010, only one party was outright against immigration, and they only won 6% of the seats in parliament. By 2022, that party had grown to be the third biggest in Sweden, and other parties had changed their platforms such that parties advocating stricter stances on immigration now make up 82% of the Swedish parliament. And so it's quite clear that Swedish sentiment has gotten worse in regards to immigrants as a result of, at least partially, integration and assimilation failures, and also a breakdown of law and order. But what does this mean? Like I said, both sides are feeling existential angst. This is not to say that Muslims have no place in Europe. They do. They are compatible with Western culture. This is not to say that the Swedish government has let down all immigrants. The Swedish government has done a lot, and the Swedish people have been very generous. I want us to take a step back and look at the data as objectively as possible, because if we keep viewing this issue through a binary, we'll never come to a true conclusion. And Sweden and Europe more broadly are sitting on a time bomb. Over the last year, we've seen Quran burnings outside mosques. We've seen counter-protests and riots targeting police. We've seen emerging conspiracy theories amongst Arabs that the government is stealing their children and putting them in Christian homes to remove their Islamic heritage. And so both sides fear that their culture is being completely overrun by the other. And right now, only about 8% of the Swedish population is Muslim. Pew predicts that the percentage of the European population that will be Muslim by 2050 will range between 11 and 31%, meaning that if the Swedish government and Swedish society doesn't figure out how to integrate a little bit better and solve these cultural cleavages that are isolating Sweden into basically two countries, we're going to see massive issues. Imagine if 31% of the population is Muslim and they can form an Islamist party, and then the other 60% of Sweden is radicalized against them and forms a political party, right? That's a huge split. And so, like I said, I just think we need to take a more nuanced approach to this cultural clash in Sweden, because as it currently stands, if we keep pointing fingers and not addressing the true underlying objective issues, every year the steps we have to take to increase assimilation and solve these problems get more and more and more extreme. And it's going to be harder and harder to solve them, and we're going to have more devastating consequences. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much indeed for three excellent presentations. So we'll invite Addison, Kyli, and Ryan to come up. We know some of you may have a 1 o'clock class that you need to leave for, and so if you do, invite you to do that at this time. But we will have a Q&A. We just have a few minutes for that. But if you come up, we have a microphone in the back that will come around. Please raise your hand and let us know which presenter you are addressing, and we'll go to that point. So looks like we have a number of questions here. Oh, and please just tell us your name and what you're studying. Yeah.
Hi, my name is Zoe, and I'm studying nursing and minoring in global women's studies. My question is for Kyli. I was wondering, in all your studies about modern genocides, did you find any notable or effective resources or programs for women who suffered from instances of rape?
Yes, I did. Okay. Hello. Yeah, I'll just mention Rwanda particularly. There are so many nonprofits that focus particularly on women, and just in my recent studies in Cambodia, even in Utah, there are centers for women that have undergone rape to conflict, like even in Utah. So I've seen mostly through NGOs and nonprofits. That's been like the biggest resource I found, but I'm hoping to see more like government programs, like particularly through the UN or UNHCR, but
Hi, my name is Haley. I'm also studying nursing and minoring in women's studies. My question is kind of for all three of you. One thing that was mentioned in the first presentation was that both producers and consumers share responsibility, and that kind of was in my mind throughout all three of the presentations. And I was wondering kind of what thoughts you had on how we as consumers of this information can share responsibility and take action to improve both these domestic and global issues.
I think that's a really excellent question. And, I think that if you look at really any environmental issue, not just with the Great Salt Lake, there's always this question of, is this the responsibility of big corporations or consumers? Is this Jeff Bezos' fault or is this my fault for ordering stuff from Amazon? And I hate that it has to be one or the other because I think it's both. And I think if we really want to get to a point where we come to actual solutions, we have to start taking that individual responsibility. And, I think when we want to save the environment or we want to save the Great Salt Lake, we do things that I think make a moral difference. Like we take our cloth bags to the grocery store instead of plastic bags, or we try and use less water on our front lawn. And all of those things are great, but I think a real difference we can make is being involved in the political process and voting. That, I think, is going to make the biggest difference.
Okay. Yeah, as I said in my presentation at the very beginning, I think in the Swedish issue, we have a false binary, and we don't acknowledge that, say, in the Swedish instance, the producer of the social programs meant to integrate people is the government, and the immigrants are the consumers, and both are failing. If you go to a Swedish for Immigrants class, which is offered free by the government, people don't take it seriously. They speak in Arabic or whatever. But on the other side, the Swedish government, I'm sure, has not done its diligence in trying to optimize those classes to reach out to different groups of immigrants, right? Reaching out to someone from Afghanistan is very different to reaching out to someone from Congo or something. And so both sides definitely share at least some of the blame in the social issues facing Sweden.
Yeah, follow-up for Addison on that question. I'm wondering, and no pressure if you don't know off the top of your head, but the split between urban water usage and agricultural feeding into the Great Salt Lake, and kind of just to help me understand where the difference comes. And then also the timeline until, the dust effect becomes super severe, and if the last year of good water has a big effect on that.
Three excellent questions. You'll have to help me rehash. Okay, so the first one is about 85% of the state's water is used for agriculture. That's statewide. It kind of depends on how you count. There are different ways of counting these things within the Great Salt Lake watershed, which goes up even into Idaho and Wyoming and down to kind of where we are in Utah County. You're looking at probably 70% of water is used in agriculture versus in outdoor urban areas. My good friend Ben Abbott here published a report earlier in January with a lot of other scientists and authors that said that the lake at this trajectory will disappear in 5 years. The wet year that we got was certainly welcomed, but you can't undo, 40 years of overconsumption with one good wet year, thanks to Mother Nature. And so, experts have said that maybe bought us a couple of years. In terms of the dust, the lake doesn't have to disappear altogether for the dust to be a problem. In fact, we are not on the brink of a crisis. We are in the midst of the crisis, and there are video cameras at the University of Utah that show dust clouds coming up into Salt Lake City already. So the dust is already upon us, and we need to mitigate the risks as opposed to letting it get worse.
Hi, my question is for Kyli. I was just wondering, in seeing art being used to portray something as horrific as genocide, I think that's really impactful for a lot of people. I was just wondering if you're going to continue using art in conjunction with the research that you're doing as you study this topic, and how you think that will impact people as they recognize that art. Also, Lily Knudsen, film major.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, I've really enjoyed doing art. I'm a sociology major. I haven't really done art since high school, so I was glad I was able to do this. But I think doing it through art, and particularly like refugee patterning, is a little bit different than seeing just like photos. You kind of hopefully got kind of like a feeling of the cultures and how maybe that's changed. And so I'm hoping to that people will see that. This will be hung up in the Ballard Center, so hopefully people can take a look at it. But if I were to do it again, I would like to do it through art again. I think hopefully it's been really interesting and helpful.
Okay, thank you. I'm afraid we only have time for one more question as a group. And then after that, I'm sure the individual speakers would welcome you coming up and asking your questions. But our final question as a group. Yeah.
Okay, I'm Michael. I'm a history major. And my question is also for Addison. I'm a native resident of Utah, so the Salt Lake is a big part of culture and everything around here. I was just wanting to ask if the implementations you were talking about were put in place around the Salt Lake, what kind of recovery can we expect to see? Would it be over decades of the Salt Lake recovery, or would it be in a matter of years?
Yeah, so obviously it depends on what we do. I think the kind of reasonable plans that have been put in place say, let's save this thing in 10 years. And we can reasonably do that if we start acting right away. And not just at the margins, but really get down to the core water issues. So yeah, you're looking about a decade's recovery, but you know, that will require action immediately.
All right, thank you. You can tell like all the discussion this has provoked. These are three really engaging, terrific and important presentations. Please join me one more time in thanking our presenters.